microphone problems here. My name is Liz Colburn, and I'm the chair of the Cape Fear Housing Coalition. How's that? Is that better? I want to start by thanking the many coalition members who donated their time and skills to making this event happen, particularly our Advocacy and Education Committee, particularly Amy Davis and Brandon Dietrich, who co-chair that committee, and were willing to be here at 7 o'clock this morning, setting up and helping along every step of the way. Special thanks to Cape Fear Realtors for donating this new space for us. We really appreciate them, and welcome you to give them a round of applause for giving this. Thank you to AARP North Carolina for donating our breakfast. Again, please continue to help yourself right now and throughout the program. We don't want to take any of that home with us. So that's your job, is to enjoy the presentation and enjoy the breakfast. Special thanks to our elected officials for being here with us, particularly the chair of the New Hanover County Commissioners, Bill Reidenbart, and his fellow commissioner, Jonathan Barfield. And lastly, thank you to the New Hanover County Library staff, Christine Ingram, who, if you want to wave your hand, is in the back of our room. They partnered with the coalition to offer resources, companion titles, as well as 2 follow-up community discussions about the book that our speaker will present on today. So it's an opportunity for further communication and discussion and time spent with our neighbors discussing this important topic. So please visit Christine now or at the end of the program for resources and to learn more about those upcoming events. I'm standing in this morning for our chair, Clayton Komersky, who's been called away for his real job, his day job. It's a reminder that our coalition is an all-volunteer group. We have no paid staff, and we're representing over 100 partner organizations and over 200 individuals from across the Tri-County area who come together around our mission to lead the regional effort, ensuring that all residents have safe, affordable homes by protecting and expanding housing options for them. Our coalition is made up of public servants, nonprofit leaders, service providers, healthcare professionals, elected officials, and local business people and faith congregation leaders who educate and advocate together as one voice, not in spite of them, but because of them. Because we have a shared understanding as a group that our regional housing crisis is affecting every one of us, every homeowner, every renter, and increasingly, as we'll hear more about today, those folks that have already lost their home, or those neighbors that are teetering on the edge of housing crisis. We come together this morning and all year round to call for safe, affordable homes for all of our neighbors, those who are members of our workforce and those who cannot work, those new residents who have just joined our community, and those lifelong residents who want to stay here and who are being displaced every day. We care for and are concerned for the tens of thousands of households who struggle every day, who work hard, who add value to our community, who are our neighbors, and who deserve to be here to enjoy the quality of life that coastal North Carolina has to offer, just as much as anyone else does. Our coalition envisions a future for our region where housing is safe, affordable, and abundant, where everyone is welcome, where you can build a family and build a career, where you can pursue your dreams without being held back by the cost of living. But this future only happens with bold leadership and with transformative investment, both in existing programs and in new creative housing solutions here in Wilmington and across the Tri-County region. And there was a time where we would have been hard-pressed to find 50 people in our community willing to show up at 8 a.m. To talk about affordable housing on a Monday after a time change that I did not know was happening until it happened. So special apologies and thanks to our speaker for being on a 4-hour delay, not a 3-hour delay, to be here with us all the way from the West Coast. But again, it's hard to express how moved we are to see 200 plus of our neighbors here because they're concerned, because they share our concerns and they're worried for their neighbors. And to know that our movement is growing, to know that you're just as concerned as we are and ready to do something about it. So we welcome you to join our coalition if you've not already done so, to attend one of our monthly meetings. They're free to attend and open to the public, and we meet virtually to make it as easy as possible for folks from not just Wilmington or New Hanover County, but across the area to participate. We hope you enjoyed the presentation this morning, and we hope that you'll stick around till the end. There will be an opportunity for Q&A for our speaker. You're welcome to raise your hand at the end of the presentation, and we'll bring a microphone to you. On behalf of our coalition, again, thank you for being here. And our first speaker is a familiar face to many of us. He's an annual visitor to our breakfast, and we just could not be more grateful for his support and for all he does, not just for our coalition, but for movements and for housing affordability across the state. Samuel is the executive director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition. He's based in Raleigh and has worked there since 2015. He currently chairs the Housing Recovery Support Function of the North Carolina State Disaster Recovery Task Force. He does a lot. He's appointed to the North Carolina Interagency Council on Coordinating Homeless Programs. He sits on the board of directors for the Council of Independent State Housing Associations. Samuel has a background in community development and public policy from his time at Habitat for Humanity of Wake County, AmeriCorps Vista, and the Peace Corps. Samuel is also a Baptist minister, he didn't do enough already, and who has served in churches in North Carolina and in Texas. So please welcome Samuel Gunter.
Bios usually sound more impressive than they actually are. I don't do a lot of ministering lately, although I do. So for language geeks out there, one of my favorite things about being a minister is that to marry is both a transitive and intransitive verb. So I can tell you, I've married 5 of my cousins at this point. And it sounds funny, but it's not. I'm doing another cousin's wedding coming up in December. That's mostly on the minister front what I do. Well, I do moonlight on the piano at a couple of churches occasionally. So good morning. Yeah, drove in from Durham. So the daylight savings time was boy. I'm really thankful to Stephanie for driving this morning because I think I might have abandoned her and dozed off for like a quick minute. A couple of times there toward the end. Hi, I'm Samuel. It's good to see you guys. How many of you have been here where I've spoken before? I've been coming for a couple of years now. It's great to see y'all. So again, I'm Samuel Gunter. I'm the executive director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition. We as an organization are, actually I think I've got a presentation here. Yeah, so we have been around like a lot of other state housing coalitions since the late 80s. We are a broad coalition of everyone who does this work, from folks that work on the emergency shelter end and the homelessness services end of the housing continuum, all the way up to kind of big multifamily developers and everyone in between, housing counseling agencies, Habitat affiliates, units of local government that do this work and think about the affordability of housing, especially at the lower end of the income spectrum. We came into being in the late 80s at around the time when our federal government was beginning to back out of a lot of housing investments. And much like other state coalitions that all spooled up at the same time, they were asking their states to step into the gap. And I think that's one way to think about us, is a coalition of folks who do this work, think about this work, care about this work, who are constantly thinking about how we're going to step into the gap, right? And that gap shifts over time, as has our work. But we tend to be the ones kind of with an eye on advocacy at the state level and how all our policies, federal, state, and local, kind of connect across the whole state. So that's a little bit about who we are. You can find more about us on our website. I also want to introduce our policy director, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz. Could you stand up? So when I started the coalition, I was our policy director, and so Stephanie's in this role now. If you have questions on what's going on at the GA, how is this bill relating to what I do, Stephanie is fantastic. So we'll have her contact info up here, but she is someone you absolutely should know. I'm going to talk for a minute, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on data, in large part because our next speaker is going to be doing some data stuff. Some terms. Cost burden. Who knows? When we say cost burden, what do we mean? You've heard me speak. Who knows?
We're spending more than 30% of your
More than 30% of your income on housing. That's it. There's another term. We have severely cost burden, which anyone know? Severely cost burden? 50%. Great. These are just terms we throw around. So you can take a look at what we're looking at right here. And he's going to go into a little bit more. What I'll say about this, in terms of housing costs, we had a keynote speaker at our conference a couple of years ago, and there were 2 data points that really still stick with me. Dr. Johnson from UNC, who does demographics at UNC. And I was floored when I heard it, and I repeat it everywhere I go. The Southeast as a region has positive net in-migration from every region of the country and international. What that means is more people are moving here than are moving there from everywhere in the world, right? It's the only region in the country that's true. The bulk of that growth in the Southeast is Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia. And the bulk of that growth in North Carolina is in about 10 counties, right? So that's one. People are coming here from everywhere. And the other piece is that the average incomes of the folks coming are about $30,000 a year higher than the folks who stay. And so those two data points together, when you think about our housing market, costs, on and on down the line, it puts some of that into context. I'm still blown away by that. What we have seen over the time that I've done this work, when I started, we would spend a lot of time on data. I would spend a lot of time trying to print beautiful infographics that make the stuff engaging so that you can convince people that this is a thing to pay attention to, right? For anyone who advocates on anything, that education, that public education is usually a really key component, and the bulk of your time is there. How do you get folks to pay attention? Think that this is important. I don't have to do any of that work right now, primarily because everyone's feeling it. And that housing cost burden that has always existed at the lowest end of the income spectrum has crept further and further and further up into the middle income bands. And so everyone has housing on the mind. And I'm going to skip ahead just a minute to some housing legislation. We had over 72 bills filed at the state level that related to housing affordability this year. That is unheard of in North Carolina. We generally do not see housing as an issue that tracks at the state level in this state, and really in any state. It's a thing that as a local politician, and I think we have a couple of local politicians here, it can get you voted out of office if you make some steps on the housing front, right? People are paying attention. But at the state level, it's not usually an issue that tracks. And when it does track, what we've seen is it's not an issue that usually splits very neatly between Republicans and Democrats, right? So we saw some legislation a couple of years ago that many of you probably saw around zoning that would have allowed ADUs statewide, it would have limited minimum lot size statewide, it would have done a couple of things around land use decisions. And our two co-sponsors of that legislation were Chuck Edwards, who's now in Congress and is a very conservative Republican from the West, and Valerie Foushee, who was a liberal congresswoman from Orange County. Those are the two co-sponsors. Freaked everyone out that they couldn't really pick who was going to be on a particular bill, because that issue doesn't track in the same way at the statewide. So it was shocking for us, in a sense, to see what is bubbled up at the local level here in North Carolina across the state. Urban, suburban, exurban, rural, whatever your county or community is classed as, everyone is thinking about housing right now in a different way. And I don't have to call folks, they're calling us, trying to figure out what solutions look like. So we've seen, and they across from landlord tenant issues to land use issues, funding for development, on and on down the line. So it's something that we are continuing to see. I'm not going to run through a bunch of specific legislation. Of those, these are the ones that survived crossover. So again, legislative process. We had a long legislative session. We budget for 2 years as a state. This year is a short legislative session where we tweak the budget a little bit, and we really only consider legislation that passed one of the chambers in the previous legislation. That's what crossover means. So a bill made it and now can survive and be considered in a new legislative session. It's one of those things from a parliamentary standpoint, if you really want to, you can get around, but it's a convenient way to kind of limit the universe of things that you're dealing with. There's a couple of things that are on the docket. Has anyone, it impacts y'all quite a bit. Home insurance, has that been something on the minds of folks? So those were some pretty bleak numbers that kind of shocked everyone that came out of nowhere at the beginning of this year. We're looking at doubling your insurance rates. That's something that is still in process. Obviously, the commissioner ended up not going with the proposed rate increase for homeowners, but that is a live issue that we weren't expecting to jump into this year, but we have. There's a hearing scheduled for October. We're still trying to get a sense of where that process is right now. There's another one that is coming out around HOAs, homeowner associations, and their power, what they can and cannot do, how open and transparent they have to be. There's been a committee that has just produced recommendations. We should see a bill this legislative session around the power of homeowner associations. That's something that will definitely come up this legislative session for folks that are interested in that front. But the other piece that has been kind of in the ether now for a couple of sessions, but started to gain traction, and we talked about it last time I was here, is the land use piece, right? We talked a little bit about the bill that was filed that would have, it would have allowed for single-family developers to bypass zoning processes if they included certain affordable components as a way to begin to allow builders to build, right? I think the last time I was here, that bill was filed the night before, and so we were all kind of processing it in real time together. That bill didn't end up getting to crossover, but that conversation and the players at that table, local governments, builders, realtors, apartment association, county governments, and so on, everyone's kind of trying to figure out what the agreement is going to be. So there's no legislation right now that I can point you to that here are the things that you need to think about, or here are the other things that you need to think about. Only that I think everyone is at a point where we know something's got to change, and players are coming to the table. So I don't have a specific policy to talk to you about right now, only that over the course of the next couple of months, those players are probably going to be coming back to the table to talk about what a path forward is, to think about the connection between local power, land use, housing affordability, broadly. That is going to be an issue this legislative session, whether or not there's a coalition that can come together to get something over the finish line. Because like I said, this is not particularly an issue that tracks very solidly between Republicans and Democrats traditionally, and the policy spaces they carve out at the state level. And so it's made for some strange bedfellows and some atypical enemies, adversaries. I don't know if enemies is strong. Adversaries. So there's a lot going on at the state level on housing right now. Always Medicaid expansion obviously is the huge news in the housing world, right? Particularly if you are on the homelessness services end of the spectrum, and the ability to get services funded. There's a lot that's going to be happening over the course of the next year on that. The other thing that we're seeing kind of around the state in a couple of different contexts is this narrative developing around local economic development and the money that has been poured into downtown revitalizations in communities across the state, and concern that we're hearing from we're hearing through mayors, from local businesses, about homeless population in downtowns impacting long-term investments. I lift that up to say that we are beginning to see more and more similar efforts in local governments across the state trying to push people out of downtowns. And that being the reaction as opposed to, my God, there's so many people down, how do we serve that population, right? The energy is being put into how do we make them invisible and push them away, as opposed to how do we actually serve them and make sure folks have a home. And it's something that my guess is that you're sensing in pockets of this community as well, and something to be cognizant of. We have a conference that we run in the spring. It's in June this year. It's late, so spring. But one of the things that we're going to be focusing on at the conference is narrative work, because it's a narrative strategy that's being deployed not just in some communities here in North Carolina, but across the country, where a lot of that energy is being put again into making this population invisible as opposed to figuring out how to solve problems, right? So it's something that I want to lift up because we're starting to see it in a number of local governments across the state. We continue on the disaster recovery front, focusing on a number of those programs as the funding from Matthew and Florence begins to get to the end of its life. And then at the federal level, we have a budget passed, no more continuing resolutions. Really excited about that. And there will be some state appropriation stuff as well. I've talked to you before about the Housing Trust Fund, the Workforce Housing Loan Program. All of that is still going to be a big part of the legislative work this year. But we have recurring appropriations that are already, because we passed a 2-year budget. So it's mostly just protecting what's already been appropriated and seeing if there are needs beyond that. Last thing I want to do is, y'all had Shane Phillips here last time around, and that was fantastic. So some of this you should recognize, and we sort of adopted it. We got his permission, but we stole it. This kind of framing of interventions around stability, subsidy, and supply. How many of you saw Shane Phillips last time around? Yeah, it was really good. We had him as our keynote. We took your lead. We had him as a keynote for our fall conference. So thank you for the inspiration on that front. For those of you who weren't here, basically thinking about these 3 S's, that you need to be thinking about the supply of housing, how you're setting the stage for your community so that there's enough of it that's affordable for folks who live there, and so interventions on that front. You also need to be thinking about stability. If folks are being evicted, if folks are being foreclosed on, that's a problem. It's a problem for your community. It's not just a problem for that family. And so there's a suite of policies that you can think about that are focused on making sure families are stabilized in their housing. And then finally, subsidy, recognizing that it's always been true, especially at the lowest end of the income spectrum, that the math just doesn't math sometimes if you don't have enough income. And so there's always going to be some level of need for subsidy. And trying to figure out between the policies that you pursue at a local level, at the state level, understanding that there's no silver bullet in any one of these buckets, right? There is absolutely a supply problem, right? But you don't just fix it by adding supply. You have to add supply. You don't just fix it by adding supply. None of these are a silver bullet. You got to push on all of them. The last little bucket that we add on, because again, we sit at the state level and think about gaps, is infrastructure. And we've seen this particularly on the disaster recovery front over the last several years after Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. When you don't have a response infrastructure in place, when you don't invest in the people who do this work on a regular basis and know what they're doing, you can't just fix problems quickly. You're going to stumble again and again and again unless you invest in the infrastructure that's going to be able to do that. That's the people and the organizations who do this work on a regular basis and understand in up years and in down years what it looks like, and so on. So the infrastructure is a key piece to that work. For those of you who are interested, if you go on our website, you can find bill tracking software. You can get some details on a lot of the legislation. Again, there's not a single bill that I want to bring to you right now to talk about because we're not there, right? It's not, session hasn't started. That's not the time that we're in. We know that we're going to be talking about homeowner insurance rates, sorry. We're going to be talking about HOAs this legislative session. We know we're going to be talking about land use this legislative session. So as you are thinking about being engaged in advocacy, if your organization touches these things, these are some of the stuff that you need to be talking to your folks about and getting your head wrapped around. I want to encourage you, we have a weekly call. If housing is your world, every Tuesday at 9:45, we have a 15-minute dial-in. We just run through the news. Here's what's happening in North Carolina and communities around affordable housing. This is what's happening at the state level, federal level. These are bills that are being considered. If there's an opportunity for, hey, they need to hear from you, it's you just dial in, 15 minutes, we are done. If it's even 15 minutes. And if you can't make it at 9:45, you can download this podcast and get it wherever you get podcasts. So Housing Matters to NC, I would push you there. Also, we have a monthly, twice monthly newsletter that comes out that includes all the call notes from that, policy updates, and so on. So if you want to stay on top of the stuff that's happening in the General Assembly, I would push you in that direction, and also any questions to this incredible woman over here, Stephanie. That's us, and that's kind of the legislative update. You'll notice I didn't mention elections at all. It's a pretty big election year for North Carolina. I'm pretty sure your mailbox is going to be blowing up with mailers and phones and ads and all of that fun stuff. It's a pretty significant year, and already we've seen some shocking primary results from state races here in North Carolina, and especially from not exactly here, but this kind of region of the state as well. That's going to play a role over the course of the year. What role, we'll see. But with the governor, we're going to have a new governor next year. That's going to be big because a lot of this work, while a lot of the resources flow through the General Assembly, the coordination, the strategic deployment of those, that's an executive function, and the governor has a big role to play in how a lot of these things happen. So there's going to be a lot of election year stuff, but at the moment we're focused on the short legislative session, and there's some housing business on the agenda. Yeah, I'm going to stop there for the moment. Got some contact information, and I need the piece of paper that I did not bring up. Thank you very much. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. So Greg Colburn is an associate professor in the Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. I'm a University of Texas grad. It's all right, we're over it. He publishes research on topics related to housing and homelessness, and is co-author of the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem, How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. Prior to academia, he worked as an investment banker and private equity professional. His research has been featured in leading media outlets, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and NPR. At the University of Washington, he teaches classes in housing, urban economics, and finance, and he serves as a co-chair of the University of Washington's Homelessness Research Initiative, and is a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council. So I'm really excited to hear him speak. Y'all, Greg Colburn.
All right, can you hear me? Hello. Not enough? How about now? There we go. All right, good morning, all. Am I getting feedback? Okay. That's the lovely campus of the University of Washington, if you're interested. Okay, there we go. Well, it's good to be here. Liz and I were joking that I didn't realize it was daylight savings time when I agreed to fly across the country. So my alarm went off at 2:30 this morning, my time. So I'm not a coffee drinker, and so I had a choice of I could either be drowsy or like my teeth would be chattering, and so I decided not to have coffee because I didn't want to do that to you. So I am pleased to be here. This is my 4th trip to North Carolina. I've spoken in Charlotte, Raleigh, Asheville, now here, and then I'm going back to Raleigh this summer. So I came up with the idea to write this book after moving to Seattle in 2017. And if you haven't been to Seattle recently, we have a terrible, terrible housing and homelessness crisis. And as someone who studies housing, I got invited to all sorts of community meetings, rooms like this, and so I did this for a couple years, and I would leave these meetings and kind of scratch my head and say, I don't think we really understand what's going on here. We all agree that there's a problem, but there was no kind of understanding of what was driving the problem. And if you were to read the Seattle Times every day, there would be a different news story about homelessness, attributing the problem to one factor or another, and understandably, the community was throwing their hands up saying, what the heck is going on? This problem just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and we don't really understand what's going on or what's driving it. So I wanted to, are we good? Okay. So I wanted to write a book that was really translating what we've known in the research community for quite some time for an audience of general readers. And so that's what this book is about. And what's interesting is I've had a unique professional journey here in the sense that I spent the first 17 years of my professional life in the financial markets. And so I do come to this work with an understanding of allocated capital and profit motives, but also understanding that markets work well for some of us and don't work real well for other folks. It doesn't mean markets are evil, but I do think we have an obligation to kind of recognize that the housing market has served my family really well, but it doesn't serve everyone's family really well. And I decided to, when I left my first career, to focus on housing because I fundamentally believe that housing is a bedrock factor of a successful and productive life. Without housing, nothing else works. And so what I say is, my colleagues at the University of Washington studied really interesting things: education, healthcare, you name it. None of that matters without housing. If you want a kid to learn geometry, make sure they're housed. If you want someone to be healthy, make sure they're housed. It is a first order issue if you think about Maslow going back to 10th grade biology. Without that, we can't achieve these other things that we care about as a society. And what prompted my interest in this was, in the mid-90s, I was an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and I was riding the subway in New York. There was this guy who was mayor of New York named Rudy Giuliani. You may have heard of him. And he was cleaning up Manhattan. And what did that mean? Well, I would get on the subway in my ill-fitting Brooks Brothers suit, reading the Wall Street Journal, and there would many times be someone sleeping on the subway who was likely experiencing homelessness. And we'd get to the stops, and cops would come on and pull these people off the train pretty violently, and then they were gone. And it was hard to watch. And I was very focused in my own world and pretty self-absorbed in mergers and acquisitions, but I would look at these people as they're being dragged off saying, I wonder where they're going. And I realized after a few years in New York that this was a spatial solution. It was moving a problem so that Manhattan was pleasant for people like me who lived and worked in Manhattan, or for people who were coming to New York to visit. It didn't end homelessness, it just moved it. And so when we talk about the criminalization movement that's happening right now in the United States, this is not new. This is New York 1995 all over again. But it's happening in Wilmington and in Seattle and Des Moines, Iowa, and all over the place. Okay? So a colleague and me actually over the weekend, we're working on an op-ed we're hoping to get in the New York Times ahead of the Supreme Court ruling, which is coming. The Supreme Court is going to hear a case on homelessness for the first time in a long, long time in April, and really determine whether it's legal to criminalize homelessness. And all accounts would suggest that they will rule in that way. And so it's going to be an interesting time for homelessness policymaking for cities around the country because of this federal legislative backdrop. So this is the book. So when I wrote this, I honestly didn't know if anyone was going to read it. I knew my parents would. And my wife read a couple of drafts, and other than that, I just honestly didn't know it. So I have been absolutely shocked that people have bought this book and want to hear about it. This is about my 125th talk on this book around the country. It blows me away. And people have said, are you tired of giving the talk? And I'm not, because what makes me feel good is to see rooms like this filled up with people who are interested in the topic. So I will give this thing 1,000 times if I need to, as long as there are people who are interested in the particular topic. In fact, we were at a party on Saturday night. It was for my son Ro's crew. I don't know a thing about crew, but it's fun to watch him row. And so we were meeting other families, and so this woman asked me what I did. I said, I study housing at the University of Washington. She said, I just bought a book today. And I was like, that's interesting. What is it? and her husband said, I bet he's read it. And so she's going through her Amazon thing, and she goes, where is it? And she pulls it up, and my wife starts laughing, and he's like, he has read it. And my wife said, no, he wrote it, actually. She goes, what? So anyway, so it was a very fun thing. So it's really interesting that people are buying this book. They care about homelessness because it's happening all over the place. So the first thing that we need to think about when, if you're going to write a book about homelessness, is what causes homelessness. And so one of the real challenges I had when wanting to write this book was I knew that there was all sorts of academic literature saying the housing market really matters. Okay? But we also know when we conduct surveys of people experiencing homelessness that they give us very different answers. So the point in time count is conducted every January. It's a tremendous public service if you've never volunteered for it. It also really puts things in perspective. The first time I did this was in Minneapolis. I'm from Minnesota. Walking around 2 in the morning in January in Minneapolis, right? That really puts things in perspective. And as part of that point in time count, we'll interact with people and say, tell us about your experiences with homelessness. Why are you homeless? And people will give us very blunt answers. My husband beat me up when I ran. Right? It's hard to hear. I got in a fight with my roommate, she kicked me out, and here I am. I drank too much, I made some poor decisions, etc., etc., etc. And so we honor those explanations because it's their truth. And so what I was trying to figure out writing this book is, here's a woman saying it's domestic violence, and I'm coming in saying it's the housing market. Okay? And the answer is that both of these things can be true at the same time. Okay? So the way that we try to honor this in the book is to talk about root causes and precipitating events, both of which are really, really important. Getting in a fight with your roommate, she kicks you out, and now you're homeless, is a precipitating event. A root cause, we would argue, would be a fundamental shortage of housing. And the way that we try to bring this to light is this analogy or metaphor of musical chairs. Okay? So imagine 10 friends get together to play a game. There are 10 chairs, 10 friends. The leader starts the music. Everyone starts walking around in a circle. The leader pulls one chair out. We now have 9 chairs and 10 people. When the music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. In this case, the loser was Mike, who was on crutches. He had sprained his ankle. I'm a big sports fan, so if ESPN were there filming the sporting event after Mike lost, and said, "Mike, why'd you lose?" What would he say? "I had a bad ankle." And everyone would nod. Mike had a bad ankle. Of course, he lost the game. If we ask a different question, which is why did Mike not have a chair? So we didn't have enough chairs. And this is exactly what's happening when we think about causation of homelessness. Is when we see Joe on the street and there's a needle next to Joe, and we say, of course Joe's homeless, he's addicted. I would argue that this game of musical chairs is exactly what's going on in Seattle right now, which is when you do not have sufficient housing, there's a vicious scramble for housing, and who's going to lose? People who are vulnerable. If you're poor, if you're addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're physically disabled, if you've been discriminated against because of your race or ethnicity, you are more likely to experience homelessness. And it's not to discount any of those issues. They're all really important. They deserve attention. But the fundamental problem we have in our coastal cities right now is we don't have enough housing. And the vulnerabilities that the Seattle Times writes about every day are a sorting mechanism. They're identifying the people who are going to lose the game when there's insufficient housing. But those factors and attributes get disproportionate attention, which is why I wanted to write a book to hopefully change that narrative. So one of the things I've learned when you write a book about homelessness is you get a lot of people upset with you. So I actually have a folder in my inbox for angry emails that I get. When I'm quoted in newspapers or when I give a talk. And so what I don't want you to do, well, I don't want you to send me an angry email. You're welcome to. I've got a spot for it if you do. But what I don't want you to do is leave here and say, Greg doesn't think drug use is a problem. That's not the point of this talk. I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to provide services to people who need it. But I wish I did. If I had a magic wand and could end all addiction and mental illness in Seattle tomorrow, we'd still have a problem with homelessness. Okay. So treatment is one obligation that I think our society has, but if it ends there, we won't end homelessness. Okay? And so we know that drug use, mental illness, and poverty increase the risk of homelessness at the individual level. If you have those attributes, you're far more likely to be homeless. No doubt. But we also know that there are people who are addicted and mentally ill and poor in cities all around the United States, and it doesn't produce homelessness at high levels. So something else is going on. That's what we want to try to understand here. So the question that we pose in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? So San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, DC, and Boston have about 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago. Okay? Huge variation. Not 20%, 30%, 5 times. Okay? So we should want to understand why that is. And if we can give a credible answer to that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of this crisis and allow us to focus our time, attention, and resources on that root cause. So a plausible explanation for regional variation would be if you have more people with the risk factors, more people who are addicted, mentally ill, and poor in a city, you'll have more homelessness. Okay? Turns out it's not true. Turns out it's not true. That's a plausible explanation. A lot of people make that argument, but the data don't support that explanation. So this is a book about cities, not about people. And this does not mean that person-focused research isn't important. It absolutely is. But this book is trying to answer the question of what the heck is going on in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Boston, in DC. And the thesis of the book is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at much higher rates. So, if I'm going to write a book about regional variation, I want to demonstrate for you that, in fact, there is regional variation in the United States. So our sample is about the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. Charlotte is included from North Carolina. One bureaucratic nuance that's really important is there are places that count homelessness at the city level. There are other places that count at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong. It's just a bureaucratic difference. The implication, though, is you can't compare per capita rates from a county to a city because all else equal, county-based COCs, we call them COCs, will have lower homelessness because homelessness tends to congregate in urban core. So what you need to split up is cities, and then counties, and then compare within. So within cities, New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are about 10, between 9 and 10 per capita. Indianapolis is just shy of 2. It's a 5-to-1 relationship. When we move to counties, the numbers are lower because you're including suburban locations. The big ones are LA, Santa Clara, which is Silicon Valley, King County, which is Seattle, Multnomah, which is Portland, are about 5, and that's 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. So whether you look at cities or counties, it's a 5 times relationship, which I didn't realize going in. It was just kind of convenient when I read the numbers. So the point is massive, massive variation. We should want to understand why LA County is so radically different than Tampa. And once we can answer that question, it should tell us, well, then we should probably focus on that driver. Okay, so the logic of the book is we're going to take all the conventional explanations for homelessness. We're going to test using pretty simple statistics. Does this explain regional variation? If it doesn't, we cross it off and we move to the next one. Okay. So the first one we're going to test is the most obvious, is poverty. Poverty causes homelessness. It absolutely does. I would never suggest otherwise. All right, last time I used that one, so I'm going to go on this side of the room, so I'm not ignoring all of you. So you're going to see a few of these. So in this case, this is testing the relationship between poverty rate and homelessness. The x-axis, the bottom axis, is the poverty rate. That would be the percentage of people in that community who are below the federal poverty line. Which, if you've ever studied poverty, the poverty line is really low. You can be above the poverty line and still be terribly poor. So it's a pretty extreme measure of poverty. So high poverty, low poverty. The y-axis here, this would be high homelessness, and this is low homelessness. Each dot represents one of these cities or counties between 2007 and 2019. We started counting homelessness in the United States in 2007. So what emerges here is pretty interesting, which is there is a statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what you would expect. Places with really high rates of poverty tend to have lower rates of homelessness, which is a total head scratcher because I just told you poverty causes homelessness. The lower right-hand portion of this graph is our Rust Belt cities, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland. The most impoverished cities in the United States have far lower rates of homelessness than really affluent cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston. Those are the 3 most affluent big cities in the United States. So homelessness thrives in its affluence, not in its poverty, which is a head scratcher. Doesn't mean poverty is not important. The implication of this is being poor in a wealthy city has different consequences than being poor in Detroit. And we would argue that's because of the housing market. All right, mental illness. The data on drugs and mental illness are better at the state level, and so we run this at the state level, but it's the exact same logic. Each of these dots is one of the states in the United States between 2007 and 2019. And what you'll see here is that there is varying levels of rates of serious mental illness across states, and it bears 0 relationship to rates of homelessness. So the problem in California is not that they have disproportionate numbers of people who are seriously mental ill. Do they have people who are mentally ill? Of course. And the consequences of mental illness are very different in a place where housing market is very, very constrained and tight. So again, this doesn't mean that mental illness doesn't matter. I think we have an obligation to treat people who are experiencing mental illness. But the problems that we have in Seattle, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles is not disproportionate numbers of people experiencing mental illness. Just the consequences are different in different parts of the country. Drug use. This is serious or substance use disorders. Again, this R squared, this is a statistical measure, as that gets closer to 1, it's a much more powerful explanation. At 0, there's no relationship. This is basically a non-existent relationship or a very limited one. There are people using and abusing drugs in every state in the nation at varying rates, and that variation almost has 0 explanatory power on rates of homelessness. Again, please don't walk out and say Greg doesn't think drugs are a problem. They are. Our fentanyl crisis in Seattle is really bad. It's scary. It absolutely deserves our attention, but it's not We just don't have a drug problem because we have more drug users. The data demonstrate that that's not true. The other point that's really important when we talk about drug use and mental illness is the research is very clear that they are a causal driver of homelessness. If you're addicted or mentally ill, you're more likely to experience homelessness. We also know that it's equally likely that your addiction or your mental illness is a consequence of living on the street. The trauma of living on the street is unbelievable. People are exposed to physical and sexual assault. They're not eating, they're not sleeping, they're not getting regular medical care. The fact that people would develop behavioral health challenges as a result of that shouldn't surprise anyone. I say, and I'm not joking, if I were living on the street in Seattle, I would medicate. It wouldn't be the red wine I had last night. Margot Kuchel, my colleague who's at UCSF, authored this huge study of homelessness in California, and she talked to people, lots of people, about their experiences with homelessness. And many of them said, I take meth. She said, why do you take meth? She's a physician. She said, well, it does two things for me. One is, it suppresses my appetite and I don't have any food to eat. And it allows me to stay up. And allowing me to stay awake keeps me safe, and I can hold on to my belongings. So there's an instrumental reason for taking these drugs. So the point is when we see Joe on the street, there's a needle next to Joe, we don't know if Joe's addiction caused him to experience homelessness. Certainly possible. It might also be a consequence. Race. So we can't talk about homelessness without talking about race because Black, brown, indigenous people are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the homeless population in the United States. Huge, huge disparities. But what's interesting is when you plot the racial makeup of a city, it does zero to explain regional variation. So the point is this, is that the demographic composition of a city doesn't explain rates of homelessness. If it did, Chicago would have a lot more homelessness than Seattle, which is a predominantly white city. Doesn't. Seattle has 5 times the homelessness of Chicago. So what I say is that race doesn't explain homelessness, racism explains homelessness. Racism helps to explain why Black people are 3 or 4 times overrepresented the homeless population within a city. It's a sorting mechanism. And we know this because we have disparities in the housing market, and the labor market, and criminal justice, and education for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that has produced these disparities. So the mere presence of people of color in a community doesn't produce high rates of homelessness. Racism does. So none of these individual explanations do a very good job of helping us understand this regional variation, so we have to keep looking. So now what we want to do is go to some contextual factors, local factors. The first one I'm going to talk about is weather. And I joke that if I had a nickel for every time someone blamed the weather for homelessness on the West Coast, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd have a lot more nickels than I have right now. So weather doesn't cause homelessness. If you're at a cocktail party and someone blames the weather on homelessness, Greg, it's cold in Chicago, it's warm in LA, of course LA's going to have lots of homelessness. End of story, you can say it's not true. When you plot January weather, which is when we count homelessness in the United States, what you'll see is there are warm places and there are cold places, and there is no relationship to rates of homelessness. It's true, LA is warmer than Chicago and it has more homelessness, no doubt. But Boston's pretty darn cold in January, and they have a lot of homelessness. And Tampa and San Antonio are pretty warm in January, and they don't have high rates of homelessness. So the Chicago-LA comparison is neat and tidy, but when you zoom out, it just doesn't hold up. Now, there is a story related to shelters, in the sense that the East Coast has constructed robust shelters, so the visible manifestation of homelessness, unsheltered homelessness, is greater on the West Coast. New York, Boston, they shelter about 95% of the people experiencing homelessness. You don't see it walking around. You see it in Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. And part of the reason we didn't construct shelter systems on the West Coast might be because of weather. That the weather is not as extreme as it is on the East Coast. But in terms of overall homelessness, which is the people in shelter and the people living on the streets, weather is not the story. So we have to keep looking. Greg, if we weren't so generous and we didn't provide these generous benefits, people wouldn't move here to experience homelessness. I've heard this argument all around the country. I first heard this in Minneapolis. People were blaming people from Chicago moving to Minneapolis to experience homelessness. We studied it, found no evidence of that. In my first meeting in Seattle, someone said, well, Greg, we're so generous. We're a magnet for homelessness. I said, well, that's what Minneapolis said. Not true. I said, where are your people moving from? They said, well, it's people from California. Okay, so then I'm in California like, well, we're a magnet for homelessness. So, well, you can't be. You're sending your people to Seattle. Okay. Where are your people coming from? Texas. Everyone loves to blame Texas for everything. And I promise not to bring up the football game, although it was glorious. So I have been all over the country, and this is a super prevalent narrative. We include in the book Middletown, Ohio, which believes they're a magnet for homelessness because of their generosity. Everyone can't be a magnet. Everyone cannot be the destination. This is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program in the United States, which came into being in 1996 under Clinton's welfare reform. One of the attributes of TANF is big state-to-state variation. It's delegated decision-making to states. We have stingy states and we have generous states. When you plot homelessness with that, what you see is there's no relationship. It doesn't mean that generous benefits aren't important. The point of this is that we don't have people sitting there saying, look at the TANF benefits in Des Moines, in Iowa. I think I'm going to move there. Okay? So the point here is that people are not making locational decisions based on some benefit. That if you actually look at welfare benefits, they're not terribly generous in the first place, even in the most generous place. Okay? And the reason is, and we know this from social science research, that mobility among low-income people, state-to-state mobility, it falls with income. Why moving is hard? We moved a family of 4 in 2017. It sucked. That's not a scientific term, but it did. 2 middle school kids, new schools, no friends, new job, had to find a house, and we had every advantage under the sun. Literally every advantage under the sun. Now do that with nothing. It's not going to happen. Social networks are important to all of us. If your mom is the only one who can take care of your kids in Seattle, are you going to move to Des Moines? Not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I like Topeka. I like saying Topeka, so I always use the example of, like, are you really going to move to Topeka? I was giving a talk in Kansas. This woman came up to me afterwards. She's like, I've heard you speak a couple of times, and I run the homelessness services in Topeka. Could you stop using Topeka? We had a good laugh about that. But anyway, the point is that this mobility argument doesn't hold. Margot, my colleague, she's the one I'm trying to write this New York Times article with. She did the California study. 90% of the people experiencing homelessness in her study are from California. Okay. So is there an anecdote to the contrary? Will a journalist go down the street and find someone who moved from Dayton, Ohio and Seattle? Sure. There's always an anecdote to the contrary, but we shouldn't legislate based on anecdote. The numbers are clear that this is a homegrown problem. We can't blame outsiders. All right, politics. Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are Democratic cities, no doubt about it. They have terrible homelessness, therefore Democrats are to blame. Super common narrative. President Trump and Governor Newsom got in a huge spat about this when Trump was in office and Newsom was governor of California. Generally speaking, and I didn't realize this, I mean, I knew it, but I didn't realize it was this extreme. In our sample, Democrats run cities in the United States. And that might be good news for some of you or bad news for some of you. That's a topic for a different talk, different breakfast. But the point is that the simple narrative of permissive left-leaning policies causing homelessness doesn't hold up, because Democrats have run Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, Philadelphia longer than I've been alive and have not produced massive problems with homelessness. Now, this doesn't mean Democrats get a pass. We're going to talk about housing in a moment. And there are governors and mayors in West Coast cities who have a lot to answer for, in the sense that over the last 20 years, these states have gone through massive booms, have not constructed sufficient housing, and we've got a massive problem. Okay? So they don't get a free pass, but just this idea of left-leaning city politics doesn't really hold up. Okay, so none of the individual or contextual factors does a very good job of explaining this crisis. So now we move to housing market conditions, which you're probably not surprised that this is where we're going. My favorite book review of the book was a professor at Indiana University who said that Greg Colburn would be a terrible mystery writer, because we basically gave the gist of it in our title. But anyway, this is a median contract rent. Basically, the point of this is where rents are high, homelessness is high. Okay? No one's giving us a Nobel Prize for this. We've known this for some time. But these numbers, these R-squares, are much higher than anything else we've seen, any other thing that we've tested. Okay? A related variable is rental market vacancy rates. When vacancy rates get below 5%, that suggests that you have a deficit of rental housing. That's what urban economists would say. And what you'll see is when vacancy rates get low, here's 5%, counties 5%, homelessness tends to be high. So you put those two things together, if you have low vacancy rates and high rents, you are very likely going to have a problem with homelessness. So when people start to get a little irritated with me, I will say, give me a counterexample. Show me a place that's really expensive with low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. And then people kind of look at the ceiling, dark their eyes. I was like, I'll save you the time, there isn't one. There isn't one. And so fundamentally, if these are factors that are really, really important, we should want to understand why some places have really high rents and low vacancies. Is it because a bunch of people are moving there? If you were to poll people on the streets in Seattle and say, why do we have a housing crisis? A lot of them would blame Amazon. Massive tech boom. Amazon's hired hundreds of thousands of people, paid them a bunch of money, they all moved to Seattle, what happened? Housing costs just went through the roof. Our home, we bought a home in 2017, it's already doubled in value. And I was gulping when I bought it in 2017. It was already super expensive. Okay? The pressure on the housing market is unbelievable in Seattle. So what we did then was just plot population growth and rates of homelessness and found no relationship. So I remember actually sitting on my couch, it was a Saturday afternoon, I was watching a football game and I ran this. I was like, that can't be right. So I ran it again and then it came up again. I ran it a third time. I was like, well, what am I screwing up? So I went into these dots and I finally realized, like, oh, wait a second. There are places that are growing fast that are not just Seattle and Boston. Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. And I realized, like, this is not a sufficient story. Clearly, housing demand and population growth are a big part of this, but it's not the whole story. Why? Because we need to think about the supply of housing. Okay? I apologize for the Greek letters early on a Monday morning. But you may have taken economics at some point in your life. You may remember this term elasticity. Okay? Elasticity is a really important notion. So if you think about supply elasticity, if the price of this water bottle goes up 10 times tonight, suppliers of these water bottles are, one, going to celebrate, and then two, what are they going to do? They're going to make a bunch of them. 2 shifts, 3 shifts, we'll just see a lot of these. So very high supply elasticity, which means a big supply response. If housing goes up 10 times tonight in Wilmington, what's going to happen tomorrow in terms of housing supply? Nothing. Why? It takes a long time to build housing. I need land, I need a permit, I need financing, I need people to build it, I need supplies, da, 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 da. And we also know from urban economists that there are places with higher supply elasticity than others. And the two drivers are the regulatory environment, how easy is it to build, and the topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build. So if you combine challenging topography with a really strict regulatory environment, you're going to have really inelastic housing supply, which means you're not going to build much housing when prices change. San Francisco Exhibit A. Friend sent me a note last year, 700 days to get a permit to build housing in San Francisco right now. Okay? People are dying in the streets. And I'm not anti-regulation. I think regulations have a role in society. I want my ground beef to be safe. I want housing to be safe. We can't wait 2 years to build housing when people are dying because of lack of housing. Okay? There should be a reasonable ground between reasonable regulation and getting the housing that we desperately need. Okay? So when we plot cities based on the supply and demand for housing, now I'm going to go back to this side, so I don't ignore this side. So change in population, think about this as a proxy for housing demand. More people move there, you have more demand for housing. So this would be high demand for housing. And then the y-axis is supply elasticity. 1 is kind of the neutral point. Above 1 suggests that you build more housing if people move there. Below 1 would suggest that you have inelastic housing supply, meaning you don't build much housing when people move there. So the upper right quadrant to me is super interesting, and Charlotte is up there, which is Sunbelt cities that have grown really rapidly during the decade of the 2010s. But because of high supply elasticity, we're able to manage to maintain a more reasonable housing market. The numbers in parentheses are the rental market vacancy rates. The bottom right quadrant, in which my city is located, is the perfect storm for housing and homelessness crisis, which is a whole bunch of people move there, you don't build much housing, what happens? Vacancy rates go down, rents go up, and away we go. Now, I'll get to this in a moment, in the sense that these are not static positions. Austin, Texas is the canary in the coal mine for the Sun Belt. Since we published this book, Austin's rental market vacancy rates in 2012 were about 8 or 9%. They're now 2.5%. So Austin kept up for a long time, and then they finally weren't able to keep up anymore. What happened? Their vacancy rates went down, rents went up, and if you follow the news in Austin, there's a story about homelessness every day. So the point is that this is not exclusive to the coast. At the time of writing this book, that's where this problem was greatest, but the problem is we're seeing this starting to enter the interior of the country. It's the same logic. If you have people still moving there and you're not building housing, what you're going to have is a big problem. So so 2019 is the data that we use. The book came out in 2022. I have been following the data since because we want to know if the arguments we make in the book still hold up. You know, COVID obviously disrupted a lot of things, but it also really disrupted our data and counting. The homelessness counts got messed up because we took years off from that. Sometimes we just did sheltered count, not unsheltered count, so we have to be careful looking at data in the COVID time period. We also had huge policy interventions, eviction moratoria, et cetera, which were different than what we had previously. And so there are a lot of kind of competing factors going on. All that said, based on the data that we have, what we're seeing is we still have the highest per capita homeless rates in the big six cities. But we're also seeing flashing warning signs in places like Phoenix, Maricopa County, Travis County, which is Austin, Sacramento, Atlanta, and Denver. Okay? So the good news if you write a book about homelessness is that the logic holds. The bad news is that the logic holds. And it holds in more cities than it did when we wrote the book. So what's going on here? Gross rents in Wilmington went up 50% over the last decade. You now have rental market vacancy rates that average the last 2 years is 3.2%. Dangerously low. Dangerously low. So if the logic of this book holds, what you're going to see is you're going to have an increasing problem with homelessness. If rents continue to go up at that rate, you have vacancies like this, any individual risk factor that you might have is accentuated by this type of housing market. And I have been amazed traveling around the country when I pull up these data. Going to I've gone to Iowa. The state vacancy rate in Iowa is 5%. Unbelievable. This was like 9 or 10 a decade ago. Kansas, Kentucky, places that I never would have imagined how tight housing markets are. So this is a huge, huge problem, which is part of the reason why I continue to travel as much as I do, is because places are saying like, oh my gosh. I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I went out for a run one morning, and I was interviewed by the news the journalist after my talk, and they said, well, have you been out in Cedar Rapids? I said, well, yeah, I went for a run this morning. I said, did you see all the homelessness? I said, well, no. I mean, I saw a couple people. And I realized after that I was a little dismissive. It's not Seattle, but for them it's a lot, because it's gone from nothing to now you see it. And part of it is because we're just seeing a tightening of the housing market. So that was a kind of a good learning moment for me. Your 2023 homeless count in your COC here jumped pretty big, and there may be individual factors going on that I need to understand. But the point is, it's like all the things are moving in the wrong direction here, and you're not alone. So I'm going to wrap up, and then we can have some Q&A here. So one of the things that I struggle with is I'll hear people say, Greg, we spent X million dollars or X hundreds of millions of dollars, or in LA $1 billion, and the problem got worse. Obviously what we're doing isn't working. We should stop spending this money. And I take issue with that conclusion for two reasons. The biggest one is scale. As I said when I was at UCLA, with Shane, actually, who spoke here last year, I was at a conference with Shane and colleagues at UCLA, and I said, you have a $50 billion problem, you threw $1 billion at it, and you're upset that it didn't end. It's just an issue of scale. Our investments in homelessness, I equate to someone getting an infection, going to the doctor, and the doctor says, here's a 2-week course of antibiotics, and you take it for 3 days, and you're like, antibiotics don't work. Doc, I'm still sick. And I said, well, did you take it? Oh, no, I took it for 3 days, it didn't work. We had an incorrect dosage. That's what we've done in homelessness over and over and over again. Is we have incorrect dosage, it doesn't work, and everyone says, well, obviously this doesn't work. The other thing that we need to understand is that a lot of the money we spend on homelessness is a response to homelessness. It is creating a crisis response system which is life-saving. I'm not opposed to this in any way. I'm glad we have shelters. I'm glad we have an emergency response system. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's going to end homelessness. It's just waiting for Greg to show up at the door and to say, Greg, what do you need? I need a bed and a meal. Okay, here you go. That costs money, a lot of money. Okay? We are not intervening upstream in any way. We have not constructed housing at a sufficient scale to prevent the flow of people into homelessness. We're actually pretty good at, as a nation, of getting people out of homelessness into housing. Even in LA, I was on a panel with the head of LAHSA. You want to talk about a hard job running a homeless response system in LA? There's not enough money in the world to take, I mean, it's a hard, hard job. And she was talking about the 20-some thousand people that they got into housing over the last year in Los Angeles. At the same time, 30,000 people entered. And so the LA Times writes a story saying homelessness went up by 7,000 people. And the people doing that work, like, oh. Because at every cocktail party, like, well, they don't know what they're doing. Well, actually, no, they're really good at their job. What we have is a really screwed up housing market that's pushing people by the tens of thousands into homelessness. And so, ultimately, we need capital investments to construct housing, and where housing is difficult to construct, we need to think about changing that. And this is the land use that we just heard about earlier. Okay. And so this is another time when people start to get really irritated. When you start to talk about changing single-family zoning, people get really irritated. As a nation, my city, Seattle, 75% zoned single-family. Layer a massive tech boom on top of that and say, like, you can only live in 25% of the parcels. Any surprise that rental costs are up? Okay. My favorite book on this topic is called Neighborhood Defenders. It's written by Katie Einstein and colleagues. She's at BU, Boston University. She studied this in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She went to the meetings where they were talking about multifamily housing. She wrote her dissertation on it when she was at Harvard. It's awesome. So at 7 o'clock, she goes to the meeting. They said, we're going to build multifamily housing in Cambridge. Who shows up? 5 single-family homeowners who are 55 to 65 years old. They're white, and they say, no! I like my neighborhood the way it is. And in the name of democracy, the Planning Commission says, well, 5 people showed up, they all said no, no multifamily housing. That's democracy. And we do that night after night after night, year after year after year, and we end up with a really screwed up housing system. So when people say, Greg, what can I do? Probably the best thing you can do is show up at Tuesday night. And say yes. And the problem is that the people who have the flexibility to go out on Tuesday night are the ones who don't want that housing. If it's back time and you have got 2 preschoolers and you get them to bed, you're not going. If you're working 2 jobs because you can't afford your house without 2 jobs, you don't have the luxury of going to a meeting at 7 o'clock. So there are a lot of discussions around how do we make this process more democratic such that multiple voices are involved. The other key one is who gets invited to the meetings in Cambridge? People live in Cambridge. You have to be able to afford Cambridge to get invited to the meeting. The multifamily housing would allow more people to live in Cambridge and take advantage of the schools and the good things in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You're not even invited. Okay? So this is a really, really big challenge. So who should build this housing? I get equal opportunity anger on this one, which is people call me a shill for corporate interests because I say that we should relax regulation and allow private builders to build. We desperately need the housing. We've got between 3 and 7 million units short in the United States, and private developers need to build that. Okay? So some people say, well, you're just advocating for developers. On the other hand, I also say there's going to be a segment of the population who will not be able to afford that private housing. And therefore, I fundamentally believe that there's a role for the public sector. And this is when I get accused of being a socialist. And then I say, well, I used to work at Goldman Sachs. Not a lot of socialists walking around that place. And there's nothing wrong with socialism. My point is that a government role in providing housing to people who can't afford market rate housing isn't socialism by any textbook definition whatsoever. It's just saying that we have a collective responsibility to make sure that people can afford housing. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, but then come to Seattle. That's what you have to look forward to. The ostrich strategy of just sticking your head in the sand doesn't work. We have plenty of cities that show what the ostrich strategy produces, which is why I like coming to communities like this, because you're at a point where you can do something about it. Getting LA out of this mess right now is super hard. It's a heck of a lot easier when you're at this level. As you're growing, make sure you're accommodating the people who are moving here and incumbent residents. So the narrative in Seattle that I don't like is, we didn't build enough housing for the Amazon people. And I say, that's actually the wrong framing. All the Amazon people found housing. What we didn't do was build enough housing such that the incumbent residents who've called Seattle home for generations can afford to live there. The black community of Seattle has been completely gutted. Why? Because they were priced out. They used to be in the Central District, which was right next to Seattle, and now, if you watch a map over time, the black community has moved to South King County because they've been priced out. Because we didn't have sufficient housing, and those neighborhoods gentrified like crazy because they were attractive, good neighborhoods, close to Amazon, and what happened? People got priced out. So when you don't build housing, it doesn't hurt new entrants, it hurts incumbent residents. Super important point. All right, so final point, and then we'll have some Q&A. The purpose of this book was to hopefully change the narrative about homelessness being a cause of individual deficiencies. If we blame Joe for being lazy or making poor decisions or whatever, it allows me to go through my day and say, I feel bad for Joe, but Joe made some poor choices. If instead I see Joe as a consequence of structure that I, Greg Colburn, have contributed to, it forces me to look in the mirror and say, well, then what am I going to do? And what are we as a society going to do? Okay? And that's a different framing, and I think it's fundamental. If we continue to blame Joe, we will never end this crisis. So we fundamentally argue that this is a structural problem, and structural problems require structural solutions. The problem with structural solutions is they tend to be expensive, and they take political will and courage, and those are three things that are in short supply right now. So the final pushback I'll get is say, Greg, I buy your argument, but I'm not convinced housing is going to help Joe. Joe's a mess. So 2 points. One is, if we had enough housing, we'd have less Joes. People would just stay housing, they wouldn't end up on the street. The other point that's really important is, we have demonstrated at the federal level that we can end homelessness. A decade ago, leaders from both political parties said we do not want to repeat the mistakes we made with the Vietnam generation, my dad's generation. When we had, it was largely men at that point in Vietnam, coming back from Vietnam, and they were grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Behavioral health disorders, etc. And so now we have the next generation of people who are in combat, Iraq and Afghanistan. We said we don't want to repeat that mistake. So Republicans and Democrats said, we don't want them to be homeless. And what do? We use the VA to fund housing and services to ensure that veterans wouldn't be homeless. And what happened? We cut it by 50% in 10 years. Okay? So the argument that these housing-led investments don't work, which is prevalent, is categorically false. We just did. What we haven't done is scaled that to a broader population of people. And the reason we haven't done that is it's good politics to house veterans. And I'm not opposed to housing veterans. My dad's a veteran, my grandpa's a veteran. No opposition whatsoever. But if that's where it ends, we got a problem. So it's not a question of whether these things work. They do. It's a question of whether we want to apply that logic more broadly. To date, we have said no, and we're living with the consequences. So thanks so much for your attention and time and on a Monday morning, and I look forward to the questions that you have. Thank you.
I forget the numbers, but 10, 15 years ago, we were building, 1.2 million units a year. That dropped to the 800,000 or even 700,000 a year. Is that ever going to come back up again? And if we need to build more housing, what is the preventing factor today? Is it government regulation? Is it permitting? What is slowing that down? And also, are we getting more? The population is not growing in the United States. Locally, internally, is it immigration causing some of the problems also? We're getting more people coming in. So 2 aspects: increase in construction, increase in population.
Sure. So the first question was, we used to build a lot more housing than we do now. We're going to get back there. My answer to that question is we better. We better. If we don't, we got a big problem. What's the constraint? And then the third one, we'll talk about population. The constraints are what we had talked about in the sense that we've got land use issues, we've got all sorts of opposition to housing, and so that's going to have to change. Our cities are going to become more dense. They just have to. And the reason why I advocate for density is it's good for affordability. It's also good just for being good stewards of the earth. Building housing that's an hour and a half away from work centers and having people driving their cars, we just can't keep doing that. And so I firmly believe that places like Seattle, people will kick and scream the whole time, but we're going to densify, we're going to go up. And it doesn't mean Manhattan, but we can't have 75% of parcels all single family. That's where we'll create the additional housing. And so my hope is that when we see the number of units go up, which it will, it's going to be a lot more multifamily than single family. And I live in a single family home, so I'm not disparaging single family homes. The point is that should not be our sole housing solution. We are a global outlier. When people get mad at me in Seattle, I'll say, we're a global city. Travel the world. Is there any other city that's like Seattle? No. No, go to Asia, go to South America, go to Europe. It's denser. They use public transportation. Everyone doesn't live an hour away and drive in their cars. So, and then they'll say, well, we don't want that. It's like, well, it's not Seattle in 1978. That ship has sailed. I mean, you might be frustrated by it, but it's like Amazon's not going away and Microsoft's not going away. So ultimately, we have to densify. And there are all sorts of regulations that we need to think about. So immigration gets a lot of attention right now for obvious reasons. Our growth has largely been driven by immigration for a long time. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants. My ancestors came from Norway. And so the narrative has changed a bit around that, but generally speaking, our birth rate among incumbents is basically kind of breaking even. But we have immigration. That's been true in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and it's true today. And that's good. I mean, research shows that immigration is really, really good for economics. And so preventing immigration because we're worried about housing, to me, seems silly. We could just build the housing, and then we could have the immigration, which is good for employment and economic growth and providing opportunity for folks. And so we can accommodate a lot more people in this country. I was in New York giving a talk, and someone said, New York is full. I'm like, well, it's really not. It's way more dense than any other city in the United States. But on a global basis, have you ever been to Tokyo? Unbelievable. Way, way denser. And I'm not suggesting we need to have Tokyo all over the United States. But the point is that we can accommodate a lot more people. And certainly in Seattle and Charlotte and Washington, D.C., we're there. So to me, the housing is a huge constraint, and it's creating all these other political issues around it. And so I'd rather fix that than start to say, you can't come in, you can't come in, you can't come in. That would be my position.
Yes, Rob Campbell. I'd like your suggestion of how we can influence the issues of affordable housing. I believe that our county is saying all the right things. 2016 land use plan, we clearly state that workforce housing and economic development is the most important thing. Our recent 2023 5-year plan, strategic plan, workforce housing is very important, along with economic development. But when you go to try to get zoning, as I recently did, and you meet all of the standards as far as environment, water runoff, traffic, those things. But then you get voted 7-0 because of density. We need greater density, but this exclusionary zoning is part of the problem. You mentioned showing up on March the 18th at 4 p.m. to make your voice known. Any other suggestions?
Well, I think, thank you for the question, because you're exactly right. This is where this battle will be fought. It'll be fought in DC, but it's also going to be fought in every single city and county, because ultimately that's what we need to change our built environment. And so, and it's hard, as you just outlined. So if I had a good answer to this question, I'd be giving more talks. The point is we're fighting this everywhere we go. There's some interesting work being done on framing around housing. And so I've been spending some time with people saying, like, how can we change the narrative that this is not a zero-sum game? Meaning, density is bad for me, therefore I'm opposed to it. We have to change that. A few things that have worked with me in Seattle is, your grandkids aren't going to be able to live in Seattle. You want to see your grandkids? They're not going to be here. They're going to be in Des Moines. Okay? They can't afford to live here. My students at the University of Washington all say, I'm not going to work in Seattle afterwards. If I get a job at Amazon, I'll stay, otherwise I can't. I can't afford it. So there's that issue. The other one that I really like is this framing of what does community mean? If a third grade teacher can't afford to live in your community, you don't have a community. I don't want to live in a place that there are no third grade teachers, or police officers, or firefighters, or service workers. It doesn't work. A community doesn't work. And this is what's happening in Seattle and San Francisco. University of Washington, we struggle to hire professors. They can't afford to live. And we're well compensated by professor status. It's nowhere near enough. Okay? So you have a breakdown in kind of these core societal functions if people can't afford to live. And ultimately, where we're going to create that housing capacity, it has to be through density, unless we're going to build way out in the outskirts. And so what I say to other folks is, you don't want to wait to make these decisions. Washington is making these decisions now, and it's too late. I had a meeting with our governor, Jay Inslee, last spring. He had read the book, he wanted to talk, and I admired him. And he said something, and he's like, I want to do $4 billion for housing. I said, that's great. I said, we probably needed it 10 years ago. He said, yes, I agree. And I said, well, we just did $50 billion for transit. And our shoot the moon number for housing is 4. And so we just don't think about housing as infrastructure. It is infrastructure. It's a bedrock infrastructure. Without it, a lot of other things don't work. And so I think we have to start thinking about the framing more broadly, and then having a direct connection to your decision to say no to multifamily housing is contributing to this problem. Political scientists have demonstrated that people's political ideologies change based on the unit of analysis. I'm going to explain that. That sounded very wonky. Okay. So in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle, which is right near the University of Washington, it's an affluent, disproportionately white, single-family community. UW professors live there if they happen to be there for 20 or 5 years. They can't afford to live there now. Wallingford was going to be upzoned. In 2016 election cycle, a house in Wallingford, I have this photograph that I use in my class, my affordable housing class. They had a Bernie Sanders for president sign in the front yard. Okay? Signaling their ideology. Go Bernie. Right next to it, no upzones. Okay? From a political science perspective, those are 180 degrees diametrically opposed. And political scientists have demonstrated that people get more conservative the closer you get to home. I'm for Bernie in DC, but on my block, nothing's going to change. And that's the definition of neoconservatism. We're going to stay with where we are. And so what we have to do is get over this kind of localized conservatism of nothing's going to change, because life changes. It's just a reality. And so I think we have to elevate these discussions higher and draw a link between the consequences of these decisions, as opposed to just saying, I like my neighborhood, and I like my neighborhood too. I understand change is difficult, but the consequences, what I would say is, let's take a tour to Seattle. Let's look at the consequences of these decisions and then fast forward 10 or 15 years in your community. You don't want that. I can assure you don't want that. It's easier to move now. But it's hard work, and so I wish I had a better answer for you.
What are you doing March the 18th?
That's funny.
Hi, my name is Kelly Canoyer, and I'm one of those reporters who covers housing in this area. Last year, I followed around the police department on a ride-along for their homelessness services team. And one of the interesting things that I noticed there was we didn't have a lot of folks who were saying that they were from Iowa or from California, but we did have a lot of folks saying that they were from outlying counties in the Cape Fear region.
Yep.
And a lot of them came here for the services that are provided, especially drug rehab services. We have some new buildings that are specific, the Healing Place, for example. And people are coming for these services and they don't have anything back home, so they end up staying here. Can you talk about the role of these metro areas in providing these services and what you think about that kind of population shift?
Yep, great point. As we discussed in the book, we cite research showing that there is not state-to-state or city-to-city migration, but there is suburban to urban core migration, because that tends to be where services, transportation are located. So there is that story. Our region is fighting this big time, because the cities around Seattle, the suburban districts, are saying, this is a Seattle problem, why should we pay for this? Right? No, this is a community problem. We are pushing people out of housing all over the place, and then they'll make their way into the city, and then we say, City of Seattle, it's your responsibility. So we established a regional homelessness authority for this very reason. to say that we collectively in our region, it's one housing market, we need to own this. Now, that has been bumpy, really bumpy, and it's kind of disintegrating right now, unfortunately. The idea is good, the politics around that are super difficult. So, I don't have a great answer for you in terms of politically how to solve that. The best way to do it is to make sure that people aren't slipping into homelessness and then you don't have to worry about this. That's the far better solution. Because once it's happening, and then you will have some people moving in from outlying areas in the urban core, and then you say, well, why should we have to pay for this, the city? And then you end up in these battles, and then you try to create a regional homelessness authority, and then Seattle Times writes about, and then you end up down this quagmire of politics. And so, again, the housing deficit is a huge, huge problem. So I don't have a great answer for you other than that this issue is certainly prevalent around the country for sure. Good question.
Hi, my name is Veronica Carter. One of your slides had local versus federal.
Yeah.
And were you discussing local government versus federal?
I was.
Okay. I would ask that you put state in the middle of that. And what comes to mind is the difference between home rule versus Dillon rule or hybrid states. Here in North Carolina, cities are at the whim of the General Assembly, while with all deference and respect to my elected colleague over there, Commissioner Barfield, the counties are at least in the state constitution. And many times I find, and I'm a full disclosure local elected official, I find my hands tied by what I'm not allowed to do because of state laws and regulations.
Yeah, totally. It's a great point. We do talk about this in the book in terms of the 3 layers of government and the complexity. The preemption point is really important in the sense that you have southern states preempting local action, and then you get states like my state, which is you have the state being paternalistic and going in and saying, no, we're going to make decisions for you. So rather than restricting local land use decisions, the state of Washington is trying to say to suburban districts in Seattle, you have messed around with this long enough, we're now going to make the decision for you. You have to change your land use. So, yeah, thank you for highlighting that. The other thing that, and I didn't talk about this because I didn't want my presentation to go too long, I think it's really important to highlight the role that the federal government plays in this. In the sense that I was born in 1972. For my entire lifetime, the federal government has been moving away from supporting low-income households in terms of housing. Nixon, in my birth year, placed a moratorium on public housing in 1972. And so, right now, in the United States, if you are eligible for federal housing support, which means you're very poor, 1 in 4 people get housing support. Okay? That means that 3 in 4 people who are really poor are then going to the state and county and the city saying, I need help. And housing is the biggest line item in the household budget, and states and counties and cities are saying, you can't afford that. And the consequence of that is visible on the streets right now. And so this op-ed that we're writing, Margo and I are trying to get in the New York Times, what we want to say is there's a lot of good things happening at the state level and the county level and the city level around the United States. Without federal action, it's going to be really hard to fix this. If the feds made vouchers and entitlement, meaning everyone got one, it makes all of our work a lot easier. Then we can say, we have people with purchasing power, let's just build. And then people can use their vouchers and we're off the races. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier if you have the purchasing power. So that's the political backdrop that makes this challenging. And in certain jurisdictions, it becomes even more difficult because of what's going on at the state level. So thank you for raising that.
This is Samuel. I want to add some North Carolina context to the Dillon home rule. So one of the ways that we see this come up a lot, I mean, for the last, let's say, decade and a half of the General Assembly, this preemption narrative has been, whether it's a water system in Asheville or a airport authority or on down the line. The way that we see we have no authority at the local level play out is usually around mandatory inclusionary zoning, right? Folks think the only way to solve this problem is if I require private developers to include affordability in their units. And if I can't do that, that's my tool. I have no tools left in the toolbox. What I will say, while it's actually a live legal question in North Carolina, whether or not local governments have the authority to do that. That's not yet been resolved in the courts. But what we do have in North Carolina is a very broad grant of authority for local governments around affordable housing. You are empowered as a local government to do more to incentivize and create affordable housing than you are to, say, recruit a company to come
to your community. You can pick your developer. You can convey land at no cost. You can do a number of things that you cannot do for anything else in local government. We have some tools. What I will say on the preemption front, though, at a local level, what's coming is preemption on your land use authority. So if you want, because the narrative now at the state level is local governments are the problem here, and if you don't figure out solutions, the solution is going to be much less, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyone want to give? Appealing. Maybe that. Yeah, it's going to be. You're going to have a lot less ability to customize whatever that solution comes. So those are the two things I want to say. Don't allow the I can't do mandatory inclusionary zoning to prevent you from pursuing the avenues that you actually have a large grant of authority on. And if you're not figuring out the local land use stuff, a solution is coming at the state, and it may not be what you want it to be. So those are the two things I would say for North Carolina.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Ben Schuckman. I'm a journalist. All right, great. We have something in New Hanover County you may not run into that often, which is a $1 billion endowment, which is required to put $50 to $60 million into just New Hanover County, restricted to just this very tiny county every year. It's got 4 main areas of concern, and in one of those buckets you could probably find housing and homelessness. It's a lot of money, and I know money doesn't fix everything, but it fixes some things. How would you spend some of that money?
Well, I would. I would. Ultimately, what I would do, and I don't know your local context well enough to probably give you a real good answer on this, but I would generally say, assuming that your crisis response system is appropriate, I would then say, what are we going to do to prevent people from entering homelessness? I do think prevention dollars are really important, and there have been places that have been used them pretty effectively. And so I would focus on prevention, and I would focus on how can we best use those dollars to create as much housing as possible. And so might it be rental supports? Might it be production subsidies? Might it be prevention resources for people when they're about to experience homelessness? I think all of those are reasonable uses, and I think you get reasonable bang for your buck. The problem with prevention in the United States is it's really hard to know who's going to experience homelessness. So studies have been done on prevention, and you might have a room full of people who are at risk of homelessness, and only one table actually experiences homelessness. So economists look at these studies and say, we just gave all this money to all these people, and only one table is going to experience homelessness. Let's not do prevention. So what we've done is, let's just wait until you all end up at the homeless shelter door, and then we'll provide services. So we're getting better at targeting, but that's the problem with prevention. So I think any dollars that go to supporting low-income households to afford housing is money well spent, as I guess the way that I would summarize that. One parting shot, one thing that I want to mention, because I think this is really relevant to your community and the state of North Carolina. When I was in Kentucky a couple times, and Governor Beshear, who was just reelected last fall, spoke right before me, and he said something that was really gratifying, because we have a line in the book which is, homes are where jobs go at night. And I got that from the executive director of the King County Housing Authority. And what I've been saying in Kentucky and what Governor Beshear kind of picked up, which was awesome, was we use the infrastructure of government to have economic development, which I'm all for. Jobs are good, income, prosperity, all that is good. And then we just kind of forget about the housing side. That's certainly what happened in our state. And so what Governor Beshear said is, we have solar factories coming and Tesla and all this other stuff. Let's make sure when we announce economic development, here's 1,000 new jobs, that we're going to have a parallel housing announcement with that. I was like, why have we not been doing this for a long time? It's not rocket science. And so the point is like, let's grow. Growth is fine. Immigration is fine. Let's just make sure that we have housing production that goes along with that economic development. Rather than just saying, we're going to give tax breaks to these corporations, they're going to come, bring a whole bunch of employees, paying a bunch of money, and then we'll just figure out the housing later. That doesn't work. especially with restrictive types of housing and land use that we have in the United States. So the point is, let's pair this growth with housing, and then we can be prosperous and we can house people. They're not mutually exclusive. I firmly believe that. Thank you.
One more round of applause for our two speakers. I get to keep Greg's lines tonight. But thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors who made this event possible. Thank you for caring and thank you for your concern. We hope that you leave today saying yes to more housing, period, for all of our neighbors. Yes to more supportive services for those that are already in crisis. And when we say yes to those things, I hope you're saying no to something else. I hope that we as a community say no. We will not be another community that buys into this fallacy that at the expense of growth, we have this unavoidable byproduct, which is people in housing crisis, people who are displaced, people who are homeless. And there's nothing that we can do about that. We can celebrate the growth that our community is experiencing and also acknowledge that there's work to be done to say that, yes, we are proud of growth, we welcome growth, but there's work to be done to make sure that the people who currently live here benefit from it as much as anyone else does. So again, we encourage you to stay, we encourage you to visit with each other, we encourage you to ask questions, we encourage you to join our coalition and the movement for affordable housing for all of our neighbors. So thank you again for coming, and please keep in touch.